Log on, tune in, find out. Another good idea from Cambridge.
Now today, as you know, we welcome Professor Ronald Numbers. He's Hildell Professor of the History of Science and Medicine at the University of Wisconsin-Madison, where he's actually been teaching for no less than 3 decades. He's written or edited more than a couple of dozen books. Hopefully we've got a few of those on the bookstall, that I hope you'll browse later on. And he's currently editing, along with David Lindbergh, the 8-volume Cambridge History of Science. And Professor Numbers is also a fellow of the American Academy of Arts and Sciences, the American Association for the Advancement of Science. He's a past president of both the History of Science Society and the American Society of Church History. And I could spend a lot more time on his CV, which goes on much more than that, of course, and is very extensive, but I didn't want to take any more of his valuable time. And so instead I'm going to hand straight over to Professor Numbers, and he's going to address us on the subject, myths and truth in science and religion, a historical perspective. Professor Numbers.
Thank you very much. I'm delighted to be here in Cambridge, especially with such wonderful weather. This hasn't arrived in the American Midwest yet, so I'm really reveling in this weather. I was asked to speak on the topic of myths and truths in science and religion. It turns out because of some idle lunch conversation a few years ago when Dennis heard me talking about my interest in this topic. Largely, I was bemoaning the fact that after years, decades of research by historians in the history of science and religion, that the same old myths that we have corrected time and time again continue to have a life of their own and to be widely known among the public. One of the biggest obstacles, I think, to improving the public understanding of science and religion in the present is to clear up the myths that still linger from the past. The secular public, to the extent that these people think about science and religion issues at all, knows for certain that organized religion has always opposed scientific progress. Witness Copernicus, Galileo, Darwin, Freud, John Thomas Scopes. They know that the rise of Christianity killed off ancient science, that the medieval Christian church suppressed the growth of natural philosophy, that medieval Christians taught that the world was flat, that the church prohibited autopsies and dissections during the Middle Ages and Renaissance. In contrast, the religious people know that science has taken the leading role in corroding faith through naturalism and anti-biblicism. If we want the public to take a fresh look at relationships between science and religion, we must first, I think, dispel the hoary myths that continue to pass as historical truths. And here I should let you know that I am using myths in the good old-fashioned way that it was intended as fiction or half-truth, not in a sophisticated anthropological or religious studies way. So we'll just get that settled right away. Scholars have long debated how best to characterize the historical relationship between science and religion. And no generalization has been more seductive than that of conflict. Indeed, the 2 most widely read books in the history of science and Christianity bear the title Conflict or Warfare. The first of the books to appear, in one sense, was John William Draper's book, A History of the Conflict Between Religion and Science. This appeared in the mid-1870s and was, in fact, less of a dispassionate history, wasn't, then a screed against Roman Catholics and what they had done to inhibit scientific progress. Not so subtly, Draper argued that the Vatican's antipathy towards science had left its hands steeped in blood. And it turns out, and you wonder, why would somebody, he was a very prominent chemist, founder, first president of the American Chemical Society, very active in the development of photography in the United States. Why would he spend so much time writing a whole book accusing the Catholics? Well, it turns out that he had a little boy who got sick, had a favorite book, and Draper's sister had become a nun in the Catholic Church. She was living with them at the time. And before the little boy died, she took away his favorite book because she didn't think it was edifying enough. And then shortly after the death, she left it at the boy's place at the dinner table. And Draper never forgave her for that. And that seems to have been, in large part, the source of his animus against Catholicism. Draper ignored or discounted the scientific contributions of many devout Catholics, from Copernicus and Galileo to Galvani and Pasteur. Only recently, we've gotten a very good study of Catholicism and early modern science from John Heilbrunn, whose prize-winning study, The Sun in the Church, Cathedrals as Social Observatories, argues that the Roman Catholic Church gave more financial aid and social support to the study of astronomy for over 6 centuries, from the recovery of ancient learning during the late Middle Ages into the Enlightenment, than any other and probably all other institutions. What would we have done without the Catholic Church? Now, the reason the Church initially became so interested in observatories was to establish the date for Easter. But eventually, these observatories were used to study the geometry of the solar system and other general astronomical issues as well. Also, we now know that the Papal Medical School, La Sapienza, in Rome, at the University of Rome now, was for years, for decades, even centuries, during the early modern period, pioneering work in anatomy and physiology. Andrew Dixon White, a historian and the first president of Cornell University in New York State, wrote the second book, a monumental treatise on a history of the warfare of science with theology in Christendom. He started lecturing on this topic in the late 1860s, published a little pamphlet even earlier than Draper, continued to write chapters through the years, and then finally in 1896 came out with this 2-volume magnum opus. He depicted the engagement between Christianity and science as a series of battles between narrow-minded dogmatic theologians and truth-seeking men of science. It all began when he tried to get public monies that Congress had given to the various states to fund the teaching of agricultural and the mechanical arts. And White was determined at Cornell to set up an asylum for science and not kowtow in the least to any of the religious interests. He proved successful in the competition against a number of heads of church institutions, which made them somewhat critical of Andrew Dixon White. Hence his interest in the perennial battle between science and religion. As he described this battle, it was an age-old conflict, a war that lasted longer with battles fiercer with sieges more persistent, with strategy more vigorous than in any of the comparative petty warfares of Alexander or Caesar or Napoleon. Some of the bloodiest battles, White believed, had been fought during the 16th and 17th centuries, the period of the so-called scientific revolution, when powerful church leaders repeatedly tried to silence the pioneers of modern science. Copernicus, he said, who had dared to locate the sun at the center of the planetary system, risked his very life to publish his heretical views and escaped persecution only by death. Many of his disciples met a less happy fate. Giordano Bruno was burned alive as a monster of impiety. Galileo, tortured and humiliated as the worst of unbelievers. Kepler, hunted alike by Protestant and Catholics. Andreas Vesalius, the 16th century physician who laid the foundations of modern anatomy by insisting on careful first-hand dissection of the human body, paid for his temerity by being hunted to death. The latest victim in this protracted war on science, said White, was this institution, Cornell University, and its high-minded president, Andrew Dixon White. Despite numerous books and articles questioning White's interpretation, especially Jim Moore's elegant rebuttal published in the late 1970s, the metaphor of warfare remains popular not only among the general public, but within the scientific and religious communities alike. No scientist, to my knowledge, or to the knowledge of friends of mine who work in the history of the scientific revolution, ever lost his life because of his scientific views, though the Italian Inquisition did incinerate the 16th century Copernican Giordano Bruno, but for his heretical views about the divinity or non-divinity of Christ, not because he believed in the infinity of the world or because he was a Copernican. He argued that Christ had no human body and that his death on the cross was merely an illusion, which got some church authorities a little upset with him. He had other heretical notions as well. In contrast to the frequently repeated stories about the torture and imprisonment of Galileo, we now know that he was never apparently physically tortured. He may have experienced a fair amount of mental anguish, but never physically tortured. He left Florence for Rome in 1633. When he arrived in Rome, this was for his trial, he stayed initially at the Tuscan embassy rather than in prison or at the offices of the Inquisition. The few days that he spent inside the Vatican at the trial, during his trial, were not passed in a cell, but in a special 3-room apartment made available to him as an honored guest by one of the priests there with the Inquisition. And to make life as comfortable as possible, they allowed him to get his meals prepared by the chef from the Italian embassy and brought over to this non-cell. After his condemnation, he was not incarcerated, but placed under house arrest. First at the Villa Medici in Rome, then at the palace of the Archbishop in Siena, where he stayed for quite a while, and then finally in his own villa outside of Florence. I don't think any one of us would love to be under house arrest for any period of time, although that was far from the fate that befell him according to so many popular studies of Galileo. We also know from Andrew Dixon White and many others that the church taught during the Middle Ages that the earth was flat. And we owe it to the brave, heroic Christopher Columbus for proving empirically by sailing to North America that the world was really round. Unfortunately, one of the people responsible for this notion was a very distinguished 19th century scholar here at Cambridge University, William Whewell, who popularized this view in his History of Inductive Sciences. But even before, a few years before Whewell, as the historian Jeffrey Russell has shown, an American writer named Washington Irving, in a somewhat fictionalized biography of Columbus, talked about the earth being flat. So it wasn't until the 19th century that people began to think that, oh, in the Middle Ages, everybody had thought that the earth was flat. In fact, at least going back as far as Aristotle and up through the 16th century, almost nobody thought the earth was flat. The earth was almost universally depicted by educated people as a sphere. And there are two people in the Middle Ages who argued for the non-sphericity of the earth, and they, of course, were the ones that Whewell cited back in the first half of the 19th century and continued to be the representatives of medieval thought going on down into the future. In the early 19th century, the psychologist Sigmund Freud noted that science had already inflicted on humanity three great outrages upon its naive self-love. The first, associated with the 16th century astronomer Nicholas Copernicus, when it realized that our Earth was not the center of the universe, but only a tiny speck in the world system of a magnitude hardly conceivable. The second, according to Freud, was associated with Charles Darwin, when biological research robbed man of his peculiar privilege of having been specially created and relegated him to a descendant from the animal world. Conceitedly, Freud went on to observe that man's craving for grandiosity is now suffering the third and most bitter blow, this time at the hands of psychoanalysts such as himself, who were showing that humans behaved under the influence of unconscious urges. Now, Freud need not have worried much about the mental sufferings inflicted by modern science. Copernicanism had indeed dislodged humans from the center of the cosmos, but that was a positive move. According to the accepted cosmology of the time, the center of the universe was the worst place to be. And if you read through the literature, as I haven't done much, but colleagues of mine have done, you rarely find people complaining about being dislodged from this terrible center of the universe. They had many other objections, perhaps, biblical and experiential as well, but rarely from being dislodged. That's just another fiction that started to be circulated. Psychoanalysis never achieved the prominence it founder dreamed of, so never caused the trauma that he anticipated among most people. But what of Darwinism? What about its effects? How much emotional distress did the revelation of ancestral apes cause humans? Now here we have some very interesting statements, two of which I want to read to you now, about the impact. The historian Peter J. Bowler has said, Darwinism's greatest triumph was that it soon established a complete break between science and religion. Interesting. But rather modest compared to what the late Ernst Mayr said in one of his latest books before his death, in What Evolution Is, he says, "No wonder the origin caused such turmoil. It almost single-handedly effected the secularization of science." Well, this raises an interesting question. To what extent has science been implicated in something called secularization? Now, back in the 60s and 70s, a lot of sociologists especially, and a few historians as well, talked about the history of secularization and predicted that pretty soon the world was going to be entirely secular. One of the most distinguished anthropologists in America, Anthony Wallace, wrote in a textbook in 1966, "The evolutionary future of religion is extinction," based on extensive empirical research, I'm sure. "Belief in supernatural beings and in supernatural forces that affect nature without obeying nature's laws will erode and become only an interesting historical memory." And in most of the theories of secularization that were popularized after World War II, science played the key role in undermining religious beliefs. It's interesting today when we read sociologists. Now they're trying to explain why religious belief is so robust around the world, and not just religious belief, but fundamentalist religious beliefs, whether it's in India or the Middle East or North America, that religion has proved to be so resilient and seems to be growing, and the most conservative and unacceptable versions of it at that. So we have a much different problem to explain than we did only a few decades earlier. There have been some studies trying to assess the impact of science, and particularly Darwinism, on loss of belief in the 19th century. And clearly a few people did give up their beliefs because of Darwinism. But Charles Darwin did not. Again, as Jim Moore showed years ago in one of the most moving essays I've read in the history of science, and almost moved me to tears, honestly. He tells the story of how Darwin lost his faith. First, he loses his father, who was a wonderful physician, and according to Christian theology, because his father wasn't a believer, he was going to be burning forever in hell. And how would a just God do something like that? And his brother dies, and then the ultimate blow to his religious beliefs was when his 10-year-old daughter Annie got sick. Mrs. Darwin was pregnant, so Charles Darwin took her to a water cure that had benefited him, stayed up with her until she succumbed and died, and he was so broken up that he couldn't even attend the funeral. And Darwin thought, if there is an omniscient God and an omnipotent God who could have saved Annie's life, why wouldn't he? So it's these very personal experiences that he went through, not the doctrine of natural selection, that prompted him to abandon Christianity. A number of years ago, a British sociologist named Susan Budd studied the biographies of 150 British secularists or free-thinkers who lived between 1850 and 1950. Now, one of the problems in studying secularization is learning enough about individuals to tell what happened. But in the free-thinking literature, often their obituaries would contain the stories of how they lost their faith, which was a good thing to record. So she had a database rarely available to people trying to find answers to such questions. She discovered that only 2 of her subjects mentioned having read Darwin or Huxley before their loss of faith. Most of these people lost their faith for reasons very similar to those that had destroyed Darwin's faith in Christianity. for very personal reasons, wondering about the origin and nature of sin, of eternal punishment, and of questions such as that. Not surprisingly, many Christians and other religious people have taken offense at the negative and largely unwarranted characterizations that portray Christianity as the great enemy of scientific progress. They have pointed out that Christian Europe gave birth to modern science and that a large majority of contributors to science were professing Christians. Some Christian apologists, and I'll leave them nameless right now, have gone so far as to reframe the historical relationship between science and Christianity as an essentially harmonious engagement, arguing that science could have developed only in a culture such as Christendom, where belief in an orderly cosmos created and regulated by a divine being was widely held. And one doesn't have to go very far to find numerous statements of this thesis, that not only were people like Draper and White wrong in their history, but they were 180 degrees wrong. That science would not exist today had it not been for the Christians and their theology that allowed science in the early modern period to grow. Now, I have to say that very few historians of science would go along with this explanation. And one of the reasons is fairly obvious, is that in order to maintain this, one has to rule out all the accomplishments of the Greeks and the Muslims and Jews during the period before the scientific revolution or during the scientific revolution, and claim that whatever they were doing, they weren't doing science. Now, Andrew Cunningham, in the back row here, has had a marked influence on the historiography of science in recent decades by showing that, in fact, science didn't exist until the late 18th or 19th centuries. Before that, we had natural philosophy, natural history, and medicine. Those were the people who were investigating nature. And science as we know it, meaning the study of nature, did not come exclusively, the study of the natural world did not come until considerably later. So maybe it's a moot question about whether the Greeks or the Muslims were doing real science, because it's anachronistic to speak that way, but they were doing a lot of the same sort of things that later Christian natural philosophers and natural historians were doing. And I think it's, although Christians, as I've already pointed out, often contributed and made crucial contributions to the growth of science in the 16th, 17th, and later centuries. I think it's a conceit for Christians to argue that only Christianity could have produced science as we know it today. As some of you know, I have worked probably far more than a person of sound judgment should have on the history of anti-evolutionists and creationists. And I want to share with you a few of the myths that derive from this area of my research. I'm not sure how popular the movie Inherit the Wind is in Britain, but many of you have probably seen it on TV shows. It's a wonderful Oscar-winning movie portraying, using fictitious names, portraying the great or infamous Scopes trial in Tennessee in 1925. It's one of the best known historical events in the United States, in part because every high school and college textbook, most of which say no more than a few paragraphs about science in 500 pages, will have a paragraph or two about the Scopes trial. That's just standard fare. And then over the years, hundreds of thousands, if not millions of people have seen either the play or the movie Inherit the Wind. This has taken on such a reputation as an accurate historical portrayal of what happened that a few years ago, a federally funded body of historians produced national standards for teaching U.S. history. And in the 1920s, this group of eminent historians suggested that high school teachers should show Inherit the Wind so that they would understand the mindset of the fundamentalists who opposed evolution in the early 20th century. Now, that might be good if Inherit the Wind bore even a semblance to the historical event in Dayton in 1925. The anti-hero, as you probably know, was William Jennings Bryan, a very popular American politician who had been the Democratic nominee for the presidency 3 separate occasions, was one of the best known and beloved politicians in America, although not beloved enough to win the elections, but beloved in some circles. Contrary to what the film shows, and to what most Americans now believe, Bryan, who participated in the trial, was not a creationist in the sense that we now view creationists. Since mid-century or so, we have come more or less to identify creationists as people who believe in a young Earth history with nothing happening more than 6 or 7, maybe 10,000 years ago. And that's the way that Bryan is portrayed. He is insisting on a creation in 4004 BC on October 22, I think, 4004 BC. And one of the great exchanges in the movie is William Darrell, the famous agnostic attorney who was questioning Bryan on the stands, says, and Bryan had apparently said 9 o'clock too, a.m., and Darrell says, was that Eastern Standard Time or Mountain Standard Time? Always gets a big laugh. The transcript of the Stokes trial has been available since the end of 1925 in a cheap version. So it was readily available to any historians who want. If you look at the cross-examination of Bryan by Darrell, the person who is surprised is Darrell. He thinks that Bryan should believe in a recent special creation. And Bryan keeps telling him, no, we don't. And at one time, in exasperation, he says, we don't care if the creation week was 6,000 years, 600,000 years, or 600 million years. This is of no consequence. And he was right. Fundamentalists who opposed evolution in the 1920s, at least those who wrote and expressed themselves on the subject, almost all accepted the evidence of historical geology regarding the antiquity of life on Earth. It wasn't until this young Earth creationist movement of the 1960s took over that most creationists, and I can't swear to that, but it looks like most creationists, embrace this notion of a recent special creation. Bryan had been invited to Dayton by the head of the Fundamentalist Association, the World's Christian Fundamentalists Association, a Baptist preacher named William Bill Riley. Riley went around the country preaching the very same message that Bryan was giving on the stand. that the days of Genesis obviously symbolized great geological periods, and there was no trouble for fundamentalist Christians with accepting it. Where they drew the line, Riley, Bryan, and other fundamentalist leaders, was with human evolution. And largely because of the moral implications. After all, if you taught young people that they descended from animals, you couldn't be too surprised when they behaved like animals. And God knows in the 1920s, American youth were behaving a lot like animals. But only in the 1920s. I can't resist throwing in another aside at this moment about creationists and their views, because I keep hearing about this at least once a week and reading about it at least every other week. There's a strange notion abroad that creationists defend the idea that God created every species. Now, they may have at one time, but you'd be hard-pressed to find anybody defending, any creationist defending that in the last 50 years. I read and hear colleagues in the biological sciences say, boy, if I could only talk to some of these people and show them what we have discovered in the field or in the laboratory that shows the development of even a new species, that would certainly convince them to give up their beliefs. The problem is they don't believe that. They abandoned that at least a half a century ago, and for a very good reason. As more and more fundamentalists and creationists accepted the young earth view of creation, they had to find a way to account for the tremendous geological record. And universally, the young earth creationists turned to Noah's flood. Lasted about a year. So they take the entire geological column and compress it into about a year of earth history. Now, that happened about 4,350 years ago, plus or minus a couple. Noah's flood occurred then. Unfortunately, the Bible gives the dimensions of Noah's Ark. So you can determine the maximum capacity of Noah's Ark. And even if you make all the animals go into hibernation so you don't have to store food on the Ark, you can't get representatives of the millions of species that overactive zoologists have created. So, since about the late 40s and early 50s, creationists have tended to focus more and more on the Bible, which says God created kinds, not species. And what is a kind? Well, a kind is what God created in Eden, number one, and what God saved on Noah's Ark, number two. And so you don't have to have that many representatives, but what you have to have is an incredible amount of speciation since Noah's flood. Because you probably only had one pair of canines on the ark. And in 4,300 and some years, and only 4,300 and some years, you have to have that canine pair, producing all the foxes, coyotes, wolves, and domestic dogs that we have around us. Young earth creationists have to have evolution on fast forward. There is no zoologist in the world who is not a creationist who would have evolution acting that fast. Now they call that microevolution. Anything that occurs within an originally created kind or a kind preserved on the ark is microevolution as opposed to macroevolution. So there is no evidence whatsoever that zoologists are going to find of relatively small changes in the organic world that will convince a young Earth creationist to give up his or her views here. I know it's sad news, but I had to share it. Finally, I want to just say a few words about the globalization of the creation movement. While he was alive, the American paleontologist Stephen Jay Gould traveled around the world on numerous occasions and was frequently asked about this American phenomenon known as creationism. And Gould, right up until the time of his death, would assure these foreign audiences that they had nothing to worry about because this was a unique American bizarrity, his term for it. And there was not a chance in the world that this would ever spread out of the United States. Unfortunately, it has. Or, I'm a historian, I should not be judgmental in what I say about it. It has spread outside the United States. Let me just give you a few of the more interesting examples here. Some of you may know that Australia, especially in the Pacific, has become one of the powerhouses in the anti-evolution movement since about 1980. And one of the founders of the Australian movement settled a number of years ago in the United States near Cincinnati, Ohio, and has created a huge empire there, is just about to open a $25 million creationist museum. His name is Ken Ham. Some of you may have heard him when he toured Great Britain late in 2004, and as from what I've heard, attracted some significant audiences here. South Korea has an amazingly active and large creationist movement, and in the last few years, they have begun sending creationist missionaries to other countries, including to the west coast of North America, and to Indonesia, I think, as well. One of the most surprising areas to receive creationism warmly has been Russia. With the fall of the Soviet Union, Russian officials in the Ministry of Education began contacting American creationists, inviting them to write textbooks and to come over and give them advice on how to teach creationism in the schools of Russia. And they had a very interesting historical justification for doing this. They had lived through the days when Lysenkoism was imposed on Russian biology. And now they wanted academic freedom. And not just one dogma, neo-Darwinism, being taught to Russian young people. And so they invited the fox into the henhouse. So in just the last 3 or 4 years, we have had the ministers of education in the Netherlands, in Italy, in 2 countries in Eastern Europe, not including Russia, advocate the teaching of either creationism or intelligent design. The Minister of Education in the Netherlands a year or 2 ago came out in favor of teaching intelligent design because, as she said, it was one view that could bring Christian, Jews, and Muslims all together. Certainly, one would not expect this American bizarrity to have spread to non-Christian cultures. But again, one of the most active and successful anti-evolution movements in the world today is now centered in Istanbul, Turkey. It's called the Science Research Institute, or BAV is the, I have no idea what the B, A, and B stand for, but BA is what it's sometimes referred to in Turkey. And it's headed by a charismatic religious scientific fellow named Harun Yahya. His real name was Adnan Akhtar, but he has taken the pen name of Harun Yahya. He's been active since about 1990. He was trained first as an interior designer and then studied philosophy, but was never allowed to graduate from the university that he was attending. But is clearly a very bright and charismatic individual. And he has decided, unlike most people, he claims, in the Muslim world, to try to harmonize Islamic teachings, the teachings of the Quran, with modern science. Most, he says, of his peers just don't pay any attention to modern science. But he wants to integrate them, or at least show how they should interact. He has written over 100 books. In the early ones, he would frequently deny the Holocaust. More recently, especially since the bombings or the airplane crashes in 9/11, he has made a distinction between opposing Zionism and Israel, so that he's an anti-Zionist but not an anti-Semite now. He's written a number of books opposing evolution, which he thinks is an atheistic, materialistic point of view. His book, the most popular one, The Evolution Deceit, has been translated into any number of languages and distributed around the world in millions of copies of The Evolution Deceit are now circulating. For a while, the Discovery Institute, the home of the intelligent design movement, had listed on its website, Harun Yahya's website, as the Islamic Intelligent Design website, even after Harun Yahya denounced intelligent design on his website because it doesn't acknowledge the work of Allah. Now, certainly, the United Kingdom will be spared from this American bizarrety, because there aren't enough good Christians here to succumb to the wiles of creationism. And certainly that seemed to have been the notion until recently. But as many of you know even better than I do, there has been a fair amount of activity in recent years in the creationist camp. John Polkinghorne, I know, has been opposing this, and Colin Russell and others, this threat. But I was most surprised to see the results published in The Guardian not long ago of a poll surveying the British people. Now, some of you may know that polls in the United States, depending on which ones, about 50-some% of Americans believe that the first humans were created no more than 10,000 years ago. That's going up in recent years. 2/3 of Americans believe that creationism should be taught in the public schools. There are only about 10% of Americans who would not identify themselves as theists in one way or the other. But what about in the United Kingdom? Well, this survey published in The Guardian, which some of you may have seen, I don't know how many of you read The Guardian, but fortunately it's available on the web, people in America, showed that a minority of British people believed in regular evolution. 21%, as I recall, believed in theistic evolution, and 20% of the British people said that they were creationists, which seems a lot higher than any estimate I have heard, even from talking to creationists in the United Kingdom. in recent years. It seems to somebody like me that every day the United Kingdom is becoming more and more like the United States. Thank you.
I'd like to invite your thoughts on an issue in the history of creationism. It was kind of implicit, I think, in some of what you were saying, but I'd like to draw it out. There seems to be a point where creationism turns into creation science. That back at the time of the Scopes trial, it wasn't claiming to be a science in the way that in the latter part of the 20th century it's been
Absolutely
claiming.
right.
And I'd be interested in, in how much you agree with that, and if so, when and how that transition took place.
It took place in 1970, within a few months of 1970. As the young earth creationists were trying to get into the public schools of America. In 1968, the U.S. Supreme Court ruled that the last of the anti-evolution laws from the 1920s was unconstitutional. Okay, so creationists could no longer try to oppose evolution in that way. So the only door that seemed to be open at the time, in the late 60s, was to rename biblical creationism scientific creationism. And the only difference was to strip out any direct references to the biblical events and characters. So you don't see Adam and Eve, you don't see the Garden of Eden or Noah, but you have the same sequence. And for some of their more important books, they actually brought out two editions. One for Christian schools that retained the biblical references, and then one for secular schools that could be adopted by the state or school district. And that's when they started using, I've even found little memos from a board meeting where they were told they should start using scientific creationism or creation science. They were synonymous terms for that particular purpose. To get into the schools. Now, there was another interesting influence, too, is that half of the founders of the Creation Research Society were Lutherans. And from the Missouri Synod, which is a conservative Lutheran group in the United States. And they could not have communion with any kind of communion, not just communion, but they can't have any interactions, religious interactions, with other Christians. Not even prayer was allowed for them. And so the Lutherans, were very much in favor of this shift because then they could say that they were engaging in scientific discussions with Christian brethren and not religious discussions. So that was another, I think, far less significant move, but that was something else that encouraged repackaging biblical creationism as scientific creationism. Yes.
Another question.
Well, if I could just have
Come back once, yes, please, Freddie, yes, do, yes.
Yeah. That seems to imply there was a remarkable volte-face in the attitude of creationism to science. I mean, in the early Scopes days, my impression is creationism was quite anti-scientific.
No. That's another myth. Thank you for mentioning that. I want to kill as many of them today as I can. Creationists, by and large, are not anti-science. It's very rare that you will find them denouncing science. They love science. And in the 1920s, for example, at the height of the anti-evolution movement, they would go out of their way to make the point that their opposition to evolution, besides the moral and other reasons, was that it didn't deserve the good name of science. Science, they would find in their dictionary, represented certain truths about nature. This was a speculation that humans came from apes. Nobody had ever seen it happen. And so what they tried to do then, in the 1920s, was to disallow evolution as being legitimate science. Then you have in the late 20th century a flip-flop where evolution now is extremely well established in the United States. And so their argument is, but creationism is now scientific too. So they're not trying to say evolution isn't science, but that their paradigm, which some of them use that term, after all, in Thomas Kuhn's Structure of Scientific Revolutions, part of the scientific community is you're going to have big paradigms for most people and little paradigms, and they're a small paradigm trying to make it. But they're not outside the boundaries of science here.
Question there, please.
What was Galileo tried for, and what was he trying to prove?
Can you repeat that question?
Oh, what was Galileo tried for, and what was he trying to prove? He was tried, that's a good question. He was tried for violating a ban from, I think it was 1616, wasn't it 1616? Where he was told not to teach that the Earth moved around the sun. Now, there were a lot of other reasons where he may have been tried. Galileo, not to put too fine a point on it, was a jerk. Before Urban VIII had become Pope, he had been a strong supporter of Galileo's. And then Galileo had the poor judgment of putting in his book, The Dialogues Concerning the Chief World Systems, which is a dialogue among three people, one of whom is Simplicio. And Simplicio gets all the stupid lines in there. It had become widely known in Italy that the Pope had one prime objection to Copernicanism. Galileo puts that explanation into the mouth of Simplicio. Not going to be a good thing. A colleague of mine has recently argued, and fairly persuasively, that part of the animus that Urban VIII had developed toward Galileo stemmed from Galileo's astrological work. And the Pope was really concerned and had banned anybody casting horoscopes about him or any family member. And Galileo was an active astrologer as well as an astronomer and mathematician. In fact, he made a lot of his money during his heyday doing horoscopes and teaching people how to do horoscopes. So apparently, Galileo got involved in this astrological controversy with the Pope as well. So there may have been multiple reasons, to say nothing of factions within among the orders in the Catholic Church. But the prime one that he got caught on was he had been instructed not to teach this, the Copernican doctrine, and in the dialogue, he's clearly teaching it. You have the smartest guy defending it in this dialogue. And so he was forced to recant that.
Another question. Yes, I'd like to this.
If this last example that you took up about creationism and evolution, is that obviously an example of conflict, as you would see it? And how do you think that will begin to become resolved? Do you think it's theistic evolutionists that need to kind of stand in the middle ground?
Well, I can't resist saying something about your initial statement, because there is a tremendous amount of conflict involved in these issues. The bitterest conflicts are actually within the communities of anti-evolutionists. If you want to see really bitter stuff, or read really bitter stuff, look there. Because there's no love lost between the intelligent design people and the young earth creationists. Here the young earth creationists have been so successful over the years, convincing conservative Christians that they need to take Genesis as literally as possible, whatever that means. And now along come the new kids on the block, the intelligent design people, saying, oh, it's too divisive for us to worry about the meaning of Genesis. Let's just set that aside and look at the scientific evidence against evolution. Well, you can imagine, And you don't have to imagine, because you can actually read the responses of young Earth creationist leaders toward this marginalization of what they've accomplished now. So you find some very, and of course the intelligent design people go out of their way to convince the public that they are not these stupid young Earth creationists. And so both sides are really trying to distinguish them. But as I was suggesting earlier, the debates that have taken place aren't necessarily between science and religion. There are no two pure entities of science and religion to begin with, but often within religious communities, within scientific communities, and even the strictest creationists will rarely attack science. So they don't, if we value their self-perception at all, then you have to say, well, no, they're against evolution, or many of them against human evolution. Hey, Brian, for example, said if biologists were able to show evolution, that was okay with him. It was just human evolution that bothered him. And that's been true of a lot of anti-evolutionists, that if you allow for the special creation of humans, then you can accept all the rest of it. So I think it's a little bit murkier than just another example of conflict. And just one final point on this. In Little Rock, Arkansas, in early 1982 actually, there was a trial, Scopes 2 it was sometimes called, because Arkansas had mandated that if you taught evolution science in the classroom, you had to teach creation science in the classroom. Okay? You look at the list of witnesses for both sides. The creationists had more scientists testifying for them than the evolutionists. And the list of plaintiffs who signed on with the evolution side, if you will, included almost all the major religious groups in America, even some Baptists. But Catholics, Jews, Methodists, Presbyterians, Episcopalians were all siding with the evolutionists. So what kind of a conflict do we have down there when religious leaders are supporting evolution and people with PhDs in science are supporting creationism? It's a little messy, I think. Yeah. Did I answer your question even? Thanks.
Okay, so Chris back, yes.
Just some further reflections on that. Not long ago, I was discussing evolution with a Muslim in this university. Now, she is a scientist herself. She's in fact a biochemist. And we were talking about evolution, and she said that she rejects the whole idea of evolution. So I asked her, does she reject evolution for scientific reasons or for religious reasons? And she said for religious reasons. So that raises the whole issue as to what extent creationists really do think they have a scientific case to make rather than a religious case to make.
Oh, I don't think you can overestimate the ability of humans to believe things that others won't believe. It's just amazing what human beings will believe, and believe it genuinely. So I don't fault them for being disingenuous about this. I think most of them have convinced themselves. After all, you have I don't know, probably 750 or more scientists who are members of the Creation Research Society. The Discovery Institute now has a list of all the scientists who endorse intelligent design. I'm sure that if you interviewed these people, that they would say, well, yeah, I do think creation science is real science. So I'll give them that much credit for basically for being sincere. In fact, they're very sincere.
But I mean, going back to your lineup of theologians against scientists in a way, is creation science
good theology? Is it good biblical interpretation? That's the question. Because if they really take the biblical cosmology literally, they're going to believe in a flat earth. You see the church has believed in a spherical earth for centuries and centuries. So they're going to believe in a flat earth resting on pillars with a metal dome over it, the firmament with windows in it and so on. I mean, how do they get around that? Do they really believe in a biblical cosmology taken literally?
Well, not to that extent. One of the worst names, but it's stuck and they sometimes use it, so it's not that critics are opposing, is that they're literalists. Now what that means is that they will try to interpret the Bible literally when it makes sense to them. These same people have a cottage industry interpreting the prophecies of Daniel and Revelation regarding the end of the world. And every symbol, they don't believe in 10-horned beasts and dragons and the whores of Babylon and all this stuff. Each one of those, each horn in the beast will have an interpretation. And they don't believe prophetically that days are 24 hours. In fact, the Bible itself says a day in the eyes of the Lord is as 1,000 years. So why not a million years? One might say. They're not literalists in a strict sense of the word. But they do want to take the Bible story of creation fairly literally, the flood story very literally, in terms of a worldwide geologically significant event that buried most of the fossils. So, but they would agree with you, I guess. I sense that you were skeptical about whether Genesis 1 taught, about what Genesis 1 taught. And they would say, oh yeah, that has nothing to do. We don't have to believe in a vaulted heaven and the box-like thing. No, they would agree with you there. But they would sense no inconsistency that seems so obvious to you. Or I've talked to so many of these people, including my sainted father, who was a fundamentalist preacher, about the differences between Genesis 1 and Genesis 2. They seem so obvious, because they are obvious. He never saw it. He never saw it. And most creationists don't see any problem with the differences. Well, they don't see the differences really between Genesis 1 and Genesis 2. One is just a gloss on an event barely mentioned in the other. So
now there are some topics beyond evolution, and there might be, since we're running short on time, other topics that, I mean, we can stick on that, but are there some other areas, perhaps history of science, we could touch on? Yes, Ian. Yes.
In relation to the conflict between science and religion, which you were referring to earlier on, it seems that it's still very current, and that to some extent the responsibility for it lies with some people who insist on pushing that science supports a kind of naturalistic worldview. And one thinks of particularly people like Dawkins and Sagan, Carl Sagan. Could you comment on that?
yes, I think that Richard Dawkins has contributed to creationism almost as much as Henry Morris did. He's certainly free to say whatever he wants, but from the religious right, he has come to represent what evolutionists believe. And I think that evolution has pushed some people in the direction of atheism. But I don't think it necessarily has to lead to atheism. And you don't have to be an idiot to stop short of becoming an atheist if you accept evolution. And so he and there's an American philosopher of science, Daniel Dennett, and occasionally a historian of science, Will Provine, who believes that evolution logically implies atheism, and they are quoted as representative. Now, I don't know that they're any more representative of the scientific community than our host is. You're not an atheist, right?
Hang on.
Yeah, see, yeah. Or John Polkinghorne, or anybody else. Who represents science, but they've been taken as symbols, and they're so outrageous. Like Dennett, without indicating tongue-in-cheek, has written that the parents of creationist children should be rounded up and put in prison, in effect, for child abuse, because this is a terrible, terrible thing that they're doing to their children. What happened to religious freedom, for goodness sake? I mean, it seems un-American to suggest something like that, especially when 2/3 of the Americans would believe in that. So I find Dawkins interesting and provocative, but he's a troublemaker. Wait, this is being taped?
It is being taped, yes.
Didn't mean that. That was just a figure of speech.
Good. Well, I think we've had a really good discussion and worked on speaking very hard this evening. So, again, can I remind you about the books down below? There are refreshments. I'm sure you need a drink by now. I hope you'll be able to stay on for that. And I think we'd like to thank our speaker again very warmly for his talk to us tonight. So thank you.